In 1885, a Finnish family named Selvela stood in a county court in Cokato, Minnesota, defending a log room they had helped put up on a property line 17 summers earlier. It had no chimney. Inside, it was a hearth of stacked stones. Their American neighbors had sued them, saying the room was a cult site. By the time the case reached court, only the Selvelas still owned it. They had quietly bought out the Barbergs and the Salmonsons years before. What no one in the courtroom understood, and what the Selvelas did not try to explain, was that the log room was the only reason any of the three families who had built it had made it through their first Minnesota winter alive. The log room wasn't a cult site, it was a sauna, a smoke sauna. And the reason three families had spent their first full summer in America building one before they built anything else begins in a valley on the far northern edge of Europe, where the summers were too short for anyone to forget about winter. The Finns who settled Cokato weren't exactly Finns in the way the Americans in that courtroom imagined. They came from the Torne River Valley, a long strip of land along the modern border between Sweden, Finland, and Norway, inhabited for centuries by Finnish-speaking people whose villages had been split between countries by the negotiations of foreign kings. In Norway, they were classified as kvens, in Sweden as Tornedalians, and some carried Finnish papers. All of them spoke Finnish. All of them had been born into a climate most Americans in 1885 could not have pictured. On the Torne Valley sits above the 66th parallel. In the 3 darkest weeks of December, the sun does not rise at all. A normal week in January runs 20 to 40 degrees below zero. A bad one runs 50 below. A house with a thin wall kills the person sleeping against it, and the knowledge of how to hold heat inside a shelter for a full day is not a luxury. It is the line between a family that lives and a family that does not. Every village in the valley had a sauna. Every family had been born into one. The oldest ones had been in continuous use for longer than anyone was alive to remember. Elias Peltopera arrived in Red Wing, Minnesota, in 1864 with his wife Esaias Kujala. They had come from Kemijärvi, a town on the Finnish side of the Torne Valley. In September 1865, Peltopera walked through the hardwood forest of central Minnesota with 3 other men. Their names were Matthias Karjanaho, Olaf Westerberg, and Johan Vinica. Vinica had been born in 1806 and was 59 years old. The September he walked into the woods of Wright County to find a place to put a farm. Each of the 4 men drove a stake into an 80-acre claim on a stretch of high ground called Moore's Prairie. They went back east for their families. The next spring, 1866, they returned and built the first cabins. By 1879, over 450 Finns were living in the country around Cokato. It is the oldest continuous Finnish community in Minnesota. Isaac Barberg was one of the next wave. He had come from Övertorneå, a town on the Swedish side of the Torne Valley that still spoke Finnish in 1860. Before he left for America, he had worked as a logger in the old country. He married a farmer's daughter there, and they had a daughter of their own. When the 3 of them left for Minnesota, they carried almost nothing with them. They made it as far as Minneapolis on borrowed train fare. From Minneapolis, they walked, Isaac carrying the child and his wife carrying what food they had. They walked west across Wright County on a road that was barely a road until they reached the Finnish settlement at Cokato, and Isaac filed a homestead claim in 1866 under the same Homestead Act that had brought the others. 2 other families filed claims next to his. One was named Selvela. The other was named Salmonson. All 3 had adjoining land, a shared property line, and the same problem the first winter, and they had to stay alive on a Minnesota claim with no lumber house yet, no stockpiled firewood, and no stove beyond the cast iron pot they had carried in. Moore's Prairie was heavily wooded, so fuel wasn't the obstacle. The obstacle was how to hold heat inside a shelter when a January wind was blowing through every crack in the walls and the nearest neighbor was a mile away. The Americans around them were trying to solve it with open fireplaces. The Finns had a different answer. They had brought it across the ocean in their memory, the way their parents and their grandparents had built it in the Torne Valley. For longer than anyone in Kokkato could have counted, it was a room made of logs with a hearth of stacked stones and no chimney. A family fired it hard once, let the smoke find its way out through the door and the gaps in the walls, and the stones stayed hot for the rest of the day. In Finnish, the building was called the sauna, the smoke sauna. In the summer of 1868, 2 years after they first put a plow into the land, the 3 families built one together on the line between the Barberg and Selvela farms. The sauna sat on the property line for a practical reason. Finnish tradition and Finnish law both treated a sauna as shared equipment. It was too expensive to build alone, too dangerous to build too close to a house, and too necessary to skip. 3 families put their labor into one building, and all 3 had the right to use it. The Barbergs, the Selvelas, and the Salmonsons each brought their children for weekly bathing and for the daily warming that mattered more than anyone on the outside could see. Inside, the room was small. A log building with a single door, walls of tightly chinked pine, no chimney, and against one wall, the hearth. In Finnish, the hearth had a name of its own. They called it the kiuas, which meant, literally, a pile. The families had cleared stones out of the fields during their first plantings and stacked them into a mass about a meter high. When they fired the sauna, they built a wood fire on the stones themselves. The fire burned for an hour or 2. The smoke filled the room and blackened the walls and worked its way out through the door and the ceiling gaps. When the last of the coals were down, they opened the door to clear the last of the smoke, and then they went inside. What the smoke left behind was a room lined with soot and a mass of stones holding roughly 400 degrees of stored heat. The stones were the engine. They radiated warmth into the log walls, into the air, into the bodies of the family sitting on the wooden benches built along the walls. A single firing could keep the room hot enough to bathe in for several hours, and warm enough to sit in, clothed against the winter outside, for close to a full day. When a blizzard was coming, a Finnish family could fire the sauna at first light and still have usable heat from the stones 20 hours later. The children were washed first, oldest before youngest, and then the adults. Babies were bathed in a wooden tub on the bench. A family that needed the warmth more than the bath could skip the water entirely and simply sit in the room until the stones had given up the last of their day. That was the arithmetic. That was what the Selvelas and the Barbergs and the Salmonsons had walked across an ocean and then walked across Minnesota to rebuild. The neighbors did not understand what they were looking at. To the Anglo families around Kokkato, A sauna was a strange little cabin the Finns kept going into, and when they came out of it, they did something that made no sense at all in a Minnesota winter. They walked out half-dressed, steaming in the cold air, rolled in the snow sometimes, and sat on a log bench until their skin stopped glowing. Some of them prayed before they went in. Some of them sang. Lutheran Finns treated the sauna as a quiet room. The tradition in the Torne Valley had always been that a sauna was as sacred a space as a church, and no one swore or fought inside one. From the outside, what the Americans saw was a group of men and women walking naked into the snow on a Sunday afternoon. It looked like a ritual. To some of the neighbors, it looked like a dangerous one. For 17 years, the three families used the sauna without anyone in the township intervening. They built their houses. They had more children. Isaac Barberg's son, whose name survives in the family record only as I.A., was born on the original homestead. The Selvalas and the Salmonsons expanded their fields. By the late 1870s, one of the three families had quietly taken over the sauna entirely. The Salmonsons sold their share to the Selvalas. The Barbergs sold theirs. The Selvalas, by 1885, were the sole owners of the log room on the property line. It was still being used the same way it had been used in 1868. And it was still warming children in the hour before sleep. It was still keeping grown men alive through the worst weeks of a Minnesota January. That year, the lawsuit arrived. Cokato, by the mid-1880s, had grown past its first decade of settlement. The railroad had come through in 1869. New arrivals from Sweden, Germany, and New England had filled the farms around the original Finnish claims. The Finns were no longer the majority they had been in 1868. They were a visible minority surrounded by neighbors who had grown up in places where nobody heated a room with a pile of stones. Members of the Cokato community filed a civil action against the Selvalas over the use and the location of the sauna. The accusations listed in the complaint included strange religious practices and public indecency. Township officials joined the suit. They asked the court to order the sauna torn down. The Selvalas did not tear it down. They defended it. They testified that they were Lutherans and active in the community. They testified that the bathing that had so alarmed their neighbors was bathing and nothing else. They said they used the sauna the way every Finnish family in the Torne Valley had used one for longer than any of them could remember. And they offered a compromise. If the privacy of their own property line was not enough for the court, they would move the sauna deeper into their own land. The court accepted the argument. The Selvalas won. In the Cokato Township record, the ruling is preserved. The Selvalas were awarded $30 in damages for the accusations the court now classified as unfounded. They were awarded an additional $40, a second payment from the town, to cover the cost of relocating the sauna to a more private location on their property, where it would not be visible from the road. $70 total in 1885. It was the first lawsuit in the history of Cokato Township. The Finns had won it defending a log building that looked, from the outside, like superstition, and that underneath was a piece of Torne Valley engineering none of their neighbors had ever seen before. The judge had asked the Selvalas one question during the trial, according to the case summary. He wanted to know why a family would build a stone room with no chimney before they built a house for themselves. The Selvalas's answer was practical. It was about the stones. A Finnish kuas fired hard for an hour. He stores more heat in its mass than a cast iron stove can pass into a room across an entire winter day. The physics are simple. Cast iron radiates heat fast. That is why a potbelly stove glows within the first 10 minutes of a fire. What a cast iron stove cannot do is hold heat after the fire goes out. Once the last coal stops burning, a potbelly is cold inside an hour. A mass of stones at 400 degrees cools slowly. Slowly enough that it is still giving off usable warmth to a room 20 hours later. Anglo settlers around Kokkato, like Anglo settlers across the whole frontier, were burning an average of 20 cords of firewood per winter to keep a draft-leaking cabin warm enough not to kill the family inside it. 20 cords is a wall of split wood 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 160 feet long. It took most of a family's summer to cut it, split it, and stack it. In spite of all that labor, a cabin heated by an open fireplace or a cast iron stove was often below freezing by morning. Pioneer diaries from Minnesota and the Dakotas are full of the same sentence, written in 100 different hands. Woke to find the water in the pail frozen. Woke to find the children's blankets stiff. Woke to find the fire out. A family that let the fire die overnight was a family that had to start the morning by fighting hypothermia in its own kitchen, with numb hands in a house that the wind had been moving through for 6 hours. A Finnish family with a sauna fired it on Saturdays and on the coldest nights of the week and spent an armful of wood per firing, 4 or 5 logs. The mass of stones did the rest. The children slept in a building that held heat for a day. The adults worked in a room that did not empty itself of warmth the moment the fire went down. Over a full Minnesota winter, a Finnish family in the Torne Valley tradition burned perhaps 3 cords of wood. Their Anglo neighbors burned 20. That was the real difference. The court in 1885 had treated the sauna as a question of public decency. At the level of survival arithmetic, it was something else. It was the gap between a family that spent its summer farming and a family that spent its summer cutting wood just to stay alive through the next winter. The neighbors had sued the Selvalas for using a technology that the Torne Valley had perfected 1,000 years before any Anglo family in Kokkato had heard the word sauna. The court never learned this. We, the Selvalas, never argued it. They won their case on the grounds that they were good Lutherans and their bathing was private, and they kept the real argument to themselves. After the verdict, the Selvalas moved the sauna to a quieter corner of their land, the way the court had ordered. It was moved again in the decades that followed, each time a little further, each time onto land that had passed through another generation of the same family. It survived 2 world wars and the arrival of electric heat in rural Minnesota, and the disappearance of almost every other building from the Kokkato Finns' first decade. It was never torn down. The Barbergs, whose share had been sold off in the late 1870s, never stopped farming their original homestead. Isaac's son, I.A., inherited the land. I.A.'s son, Milton Barberg, took over the farm in the late 1940s. Milton's son, Harvey, who had grown up spending summers there, moved back in 1979 with his wife Heidi and their 3 children, and became, in time, the president of the Kokkato Finnish American Historical Society. The Barberg farmhouse is still the oldest house built by Finnish pioneers still in use in Kokkato. 5 generations of the same family have now lived on the homestead Isaac filed in 1866. That same year Harvey came back to Kokkato, 1979. The sauna was moved for what would turn out to be the last time. The Kokkato Finnish-American Historical Society arranged for it to be brought to a corner of town called Temperance Corner, named for a Finnish social hall that had been standing there since 1896 and reassembled alongside other buildings from the community's first decades. In 2008, it was fully restored to the way it had looked in 1868. It is the only sauna of its kind still standing in Minnesota. It is almost certainly the only one of its kind still standing in the United States. Temperance Corner is a single block in a small Minnesota town with a handful of preserved buildings from the 1800s clustered on it. The social hall that gave the corner its name still stands. So does the sauna. The log walls are still black from smoke. The door is low enough that most visitors have to duck to step inside. The benches are still built against the walls. The stones are still inside it. Some of them, according to the Kokkato Finnish-American Historical Society, are the same stones the Barbergs and the Selvalas and the Samundsons cleared out of a field during their first summer on the land. They were carried by hand to a property line in the summer of 1868, and they have not been carried anywhere since. Harvey Barberg, whose great-grandfather Isaac walked from Minneapolis to Kokkato carrying a baby daughter, lives on the original Barberg homestead, the one Isaac filed in 1866. The farmhouse there is still the oldest Finnish-built house in continuous use in the county. When Harvey gives tours of the sauna at Temperance Corner, he tells visitors the story of the 1885 lawsuit and the $30 in damages and the $40 for the move. He does not usually mention what the stones are for. If you want more stories like this one, the full playlist is right here.